It's the Kink Consultant podcast, where we're turning up the heat on all things kink and dating, relationships, and pop culture. So close the door, plug in your headphones, and let's get down to it.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Kink Consultant. I'm your host, Amanda Dames, and we're coming in with a third installment with answers to your questions from my first two episodes. If you haven't already listened, go ahead and listen to episode 1 and 2, where I talk about becoming the Kink Consultant and many, many years ago, first becoming a professional dominatrix. So the first question is actually from one of my sisters, and she got straight to the point. Was this for the money, or did I want to do the job? And it's a mix of both. If I didn't need the money, I never would have been brave enough to do this. It was a very scary job to do. I didn't know what I was getting into. And even there were times when I worked there, and I did spend 18 months at the dungeon. There were ups and downs, for sure. But the answer is I did want to do the job. And in a way, I guess I'm grateful for the fact that I was put in such a position where it seemed like a no-brainer at the time. Follow-up question to that I've gotten from a few people who've listened is, what exactly was the money? How did it work out? So you weren't paid hourly there. You worked a shift, but you only got paid if you saw a client. And the way the money worked out was the client would pay $250 for the hour, but the girls would only get $80. I had a suspicion that girls who worked there longer were making more than $80 an hour, but I think that was fair. Seniority meant they were able to negotiate higher rates. I was basically a nobody, so I got my $80 an hour. Clients also had an option to do a 30-minute session, which was kind of a waste of money on their part because there's so little that can actually happen in 30 minutes in the course of a session. Like, I think that during a session, you need to take people on a journey. There needs to be like a beginning, middle, and an end. And for that time to only be 30 minutes, there's not a lot of time to get into anything really. But if you did choose to do a 30-minute session, you could do it for $150, and the girl on that one got $50. So while it may sound like that's a better deal, and it kind of was, it was still a lot of work understanding what the client wanted and then fitting it into 30 minutes. I much preferred hour-long sessions. And then there were tips. One of my skills is negotiating. People often ask, like, how did you learn to negotiate? And I joke that I read a book once, but the truth is I learned to negotiate in the rooms at the dungeon. People would come in and they would ask for specific things, and $80 was not enough, especially if I was working a 7 or 8 hour shift. If I got a session, I needed to make it work for me. So there were add-ons. If they wanted me to go topless or fully nude, I put a price on that. For example, being topless was an extra $40, and if they wanted me to be fully nude, that was $80. Now, I understand that is not that much money, and many people would never. For me, I was like, okay, they're not touching me, and they weren't, but I was just taking off my clothes. I kind of enjoy being naked anyway, so it wasn't a huge deal. However, there were girls who would do it for free. They would just do it as part of the session, and that meant that they got chosen more because the men knew they were getting more for less money. That kind of caused some controversy within the dungeon. Us girls were always talking about what the other ones were doing, how much they were doing, and what they were basically giving away for free because we wanted to have a united front. There was no rate sheet, right? But like we all sort of talked about it. How much are you charging for this? How much are you charging for that? And if a girl was doing less just to get more clients, it was sort of devaluing everybody's work. And some girls were nice about it, some weren't. I remember talking about the rate I took once to go topless because I just needed a little bit of extra money. And one of my good friends, who I'm still friends with to this day, she said, you know what? It's your money. You got to do what you got to do. But at the end of the day, decisions like that hurt everyone. That stuck with me. I never took less than what we all agreed as sort of the standard rate after that. It stuck with me because it was a little bit about integrity, but it was also realizing this is work. It's not an internship. Nobody gets to see me naked for free because it also hurts everybody else. I wish I had stood up for myself in that way and been like, no, there's value to this, but you live and learn. And as cheerful as I am talking about all of this, there were negatives sometimes, especially with the rates of what people paid for me to be topless or fully nude. I found that after 18 months of doing this, I put a value on my body, and I think that our bodies are priceless. We only get one. And I became so transactional about things in my life, like, like seeing my tits is worth $40, seeing me completely nude is worth $80. And that took more money in therapy to get over than I probably earned during my time at the dungeon. Another question, Are there dungeons in other towns? Believe it or not, yes, there are dungeons across America. Some of them are private, like the one I worked at, and others are there for sessions. Girls can rent rooms out themselves. Sometimes they open up on nights and weekends for parties. And I know people are thinking, oh, this is just in cities, but it's not. There are dungeons everywhere. That's why I tell people, get on FetLife, see what events are going on. Get involved in the community so you can learn about these things. And then there are some infamous scenes that you would not think about. For example, Ohio has a rocking BDSM scene. And people think of Ohio as like a sleepy state. It's sort of second to Florida in craziness, but sometimes often first in craziness. From what I've heard of the BDSM scene there, it's helping Ohio live up to its name. What was my favorite type of client? This is a really difficult one because I loved the clients who opened up to me and told me their entire life story. They'd tell me about their marriage and their sex life, and they would just let me in completely. Those were my favorite types of clients, but the types of session I did sort of lent themselves to that. So I got insight into a lot of people's lives. And that was interesting because these were things they probably never told anyone. And these weren't the kind of guys to start a blog and sort of spill all their secrets. Getting to talk to them face to face in a time where this may have been the first and only time they've ever told me things, that was my favorite type of client, but I had that often. But to answer the question more directly, my favorite type of client was the client who wanted to go on a journey. They wanted something extreme. They left a lot of it up to me, but we talked about what their boundaries and limits were. Someone who knew what they wanted was really helpful. Someone who knew what they wanted but also trusted me to add my own flavor in was definitely a favorite. Bonus points if they were into any type of impact play. I loved giving a caning, which is something I only learned at the dungeon. I didn't go in knowing how to do that, as you may remember from my second episode where I spilled to the manager everything I didn't know how to do. One day I did get a session with someone and it was for a caning and I had never done it before. And it was one of those times where every girl had to meet. So I went in and I was lucky enough to be chosen. And then I came out and I was like, he wants to be caned. I really don't know how to do that. And one of the other girls took me aside and taught me how to cane on her. She caned me really quickly just to show me the ropes. Then she let me cane her. I practiced on pillows for a while. And I always remember that as being one of the most generous things because she probably could have gotten that session. She was a very experienced caner. But when she found out I got it, for multiple reasons, she decided to teach me so that I could go in and give a good session. Ultimately, that was good for everyone. It meant that client was probably going to come back because he was getting someone who had at least a little bit of experience or didn't go in blind, not knowing how to do it at all. And also, working at the dungeon was always a learning experience. When you found people like this who were willing to teach, and I was always willing to learn, it allowed me to grow my craft and last there a little bit longer. One of the other great pieces of advice that I got from one of the girls when I started was, at the end of your session, always clean the dungeon in front of the client so they know that this is a clean establishment. And I thought it was really funny to get that advice because for every room we used, the girl was responsible for cleaning it at the end. And you could wait until the client left, but if you started while they were there, it really did reinforce the fact that we were a clean place. What was my least favorite type of client? I didn't have a specific least favorite type of client, but when people came in and asked for a sensual dom session, I thought multiple things. First of all, I was like, oh, what a lazy request. Second of all, I thought this person is just starved of attention and touch. And when they say sensual dom, they really just want someone to touch them. Saying it now, I feel really bad for the lonely people who came in and asked for that. But as a pro back in the day, I was thinking, can you not be a little more creative? Maybe this is your problem. I try and be more graceful and forgiving now. And then there was another interesting type of client that would come in, the super religious types. I never hated them because they lived the most fascinating lives. Their experiences were unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was like meeting someone out of the 1800s. The only reason that I would sometimes get offended by them is they would never shake my hand when I came in to meet. And that was something I always did. I treated it like a business transaction. When I walked in, I would shake someone's hand and say, hey, I'm Mila. They wouldn't shake my hand, but they would let me do impact play on them. In session, it was like they became a different person. It wasn't for me to judge the impact of their religion or their upbringing. I just remember being slightly offended by it whenever it happened. Speaking of Mila, how did I come up with that name as my dominatrix name? So on the day I started, I had not come up with a name for myself. I didn't know what I was supposed to be. We've all gone through stages in our life where we want to come up with our own name. I spent a good 2 years of my childhood asking people to call me Xena after the Xena warrior princess. I did consider the name as a dominatrix name, but ultimately realized that's not the coolest name. Dominatrix Xena just sounds like I'd be from another planet. When I asked the manager, the nice manager on my first day, what I should call myself, she said, "Who is the sexiest woman you can think of?" And I love that 70s show. I love Mila Kunis and Ashton Kutcher. And I decided that I would be Mistress Mila. I also loved the alliteration. At the time, Mila wasn't actually a popular name, so it stood out. It's definitely gained popularity over the last few years, and I always get a wave of nostalgia anytime I hear or meet someone named Mila. Rules of conduct. Were there rules about how girls had to conduct themselves? That's a really interesting question because there were rules, but dominatrixes are not the best at following rules. There was a little binder in the office of how to dress and conduct yourself, and it was full of the most basic information, like suggesting everyone showers before their shift and has their nails nicely done and smells nice. But the girls always joked that the clients that came to us were more interested in how disgusting we could be as opposed to how clean and perfect we could look. And that pretty much rung true throughout. No one ever didn't pick me because my nails weren't done or my legs weren't shaved. In fact, one time I was going on a date and I said I had to go shave before I went on the date, and all of the girls screamed, "Do not shave for a man." It was a really feminist environment, which is pretty understandable. I mean, a lot of us spent our time dominating men. So the idea that any of us would be submissive was always kind of met with a little bit of a bristle, even though many of us were submissive in our own personal lives. This is a super short episode this week. I'm really excited about next week's guest. He has his own podcast, and it was the first ever podcast I was on. Never too old for a good spanking. Anybody who knows me knows that I am obsessed with spanking, and that's putting it lightly. So I'm so excited to get to chat with him next week. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with anyone who might find it interesting. And if you have any questions or topics you'd like me to cover in future episodes, feel free to reach out. Email info@thekinkconsultant.com. Until next time, keep on kinking on.